Or good morning. I guess it's still morning. And welcome to our session on researcher-practitioner collaborations to facilitate research in adult foundational education. It's quite a mouthful. Learnings from the CREATE Network. I'm Judy Allen-Prez with APT Global, and with me today are Lisa Soracone and Adam Atwell from Jobs for the Future in Boston. And our session is going to talk about, let's see if I can do this correctly. Yeah. Oh. Oh, that's the one I'm using the wrong thing. Sorry, folks. It's not. Is it showing? Okay. No. Oh, with this. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So we're going to begin with an overview of the CREATE Network. And then I will talk for a little bit about our approach to research in the network. And then what does research look like in digital, on the use of digital skills? And what does it mean to have researcher and practitioner collaborations? The researcher-practitioner collaboration concept has been around for about 30 years, 40 years, a long time. And I think it's really, really important at this stage of things, because with somewhat reduced funding for research, it's extraordinarily important that the research that be conducted, first of all, address issues, right, that can help improve services for our adult learners, and that is then disseminated in a way that can be easily used by practitioners and policymakers. So I think we're at an interesting time where it's, we want to make sure that the issues that are funded to be the topics of research are important issues, and to maximize the success of the research by having a lot of informed people involved in that process. So we're going to begin the session. Okay. With an overview, and Adam is going to give us the overview.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming to our session. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of what is the CREATE Adult Skills Network. So we have these sort of pillars that we follow. Like, one is to generate knowledge, two is to collaborate, three is to disseminate, and then we have these intended network outputs. So it's basically a network of research teams, policymakers, leaders in the field. And what these research teams are doing is they're actually conducting studies on enhancing technology for adult learners in adult foundational education. So generating knowledge is through promising practices, doing a research review, identifying education technology tools, support translating research to practice. In our collaboration, we have these communities of practice. So we have these working groups, intervention working groups, a research methodology working group. We have an equity working group. And so these working groups are, again, a combination of researchers, practitioners, even adult learners, policymakers, and those involved in the field that focus on each one of these areas. We're also interested in the development of learning agendas for researchers and practitioner, right? So again, you see that common theme of sort of bridging this collaborative environment between researchers and practitioners through this network effort. And then support for translating research to practice. And then next we have a dissemination agenda. So through publications, blogs, podcasts, newsletters, a social media presence by the network lead, the research teams, and others who are involved with the network. We're really hoping to really widen the net and expand these findings, learnings, insights, collaborative efforts to the larger community in many different areas. Presentations by research teams and network leads, and then support for translating that research to practice again by the research teams and others. All of this is really aimed at expanding the knowledge base, the research base, cross-setting information sharing, providing resources that guide the use of technology, translate and create the demand for research, and then developing these learning agendas. So I'll give you a quick look at what, a visual at what the network looks like is we have our network partners, which are instructors, researchers, policymakers, advocacy organizations, again, some adult learners mixed in there as well. Then we have our research teams. These research teams, most of them are currently in their pilot testing phase of these educational technologies and digital technologies. And they all have a varying kind of scope of focus. And so we'll show you some links here later, some QR codes where you can go in, you can read about each one of the research teams, their research agenda and their research goals. The network leads are the American Institutes for Research, APT Global, the EdTech Center at World Ed, and JFF Jobs for the Future. And this work is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. And so we have received a lot of support from our project officer and grant support. And so this is where you can scan these QR codes to see our Create newsletter. We have an EdTech TA library. And then the Talk podcast. The Talk podcast covers a lot of different topics. There's professional development in adult basic education. There's some things on AI. You can also read about you can also listen about some of the work that the working groups are doing in our communities of practice with the Create Adult Skills Network. So that's just a quick snapshot, but there's a lot of great resources online that I think you'll find very interesting. So I will pass it back to Judy.
Thanks, Adam. Before I start, I'd like to ask show of hands, are there any other researchers in the room? Okay. And program directors and instructors or staff in local programs? Great. So it's a good mix. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 15 minutes or so in giving you some ideas about how we look at practitioner researcher collaborations in the context of framing and carrying out the research. And then Lisa's going to engage you in small group discussions so that we get your thoughts. And I would ask you, as you hear what I'm going to talk about, you think about research you've done yourself, or if you've participated as a program director or instructor in research, what that experience has been like, because we want to pull these things together. So when we formed the network under IES funding, and we're looking at the whole challenge of, what happens when you incorporate digital technologies in what we now call adult foundational education. We conceptualize this to look at the use of digital technologies at different phases, from the beginning when those technologies are developed or adapted, to actually then preparing the users of technology, which traditionally would be instructors or other staff, but also adult learners, because as we learned, particularly through the pandemic, many adults were not used to using technology, right? So there's that whole process of doing that. And then how technologies get implemented in the AFE setting and what kinds of outcomes are measured by that, and what do those outcomes tell us? And then last but not least, how do you use research to inform practice? And how do you look at practice to inform research? And today, really, I think our focus is on using practice to inform research. And so what does research involve? and how can researchers and practitioners collaborate? So we love frameworks. I do anyway. So we have lots of frameworks. This is a very basic, any research methodology book you would pick up would say, okay, if you want to do research, there are phases. And the first one is figuring out what is the problem or issue that you want to study. And that involves, gathering data about maybe what the issue is, talking with informants, making sure you understand what the root causes are of the problem. And then we go to the next stage, which is, okay, we think we want to discuss this problem. Then we want to know, how are we going to design the research project? And we use, how many have ever heard of a logic model? Okay, so what that looks like for the particular study that one wants to do, and then what the questions are that you want to ask. Next, of course, is looking at the things you want to measure in the study and how you're going to collect the data, what instruments you're going to use, and then moving on to, after you collect the data, how do you analyze and interpret the data? And then finally, as you prepare the results from the study, what types of dissemination make sense? So this is the usual steps that anyone goes through. What we want to look at today in particular, in the context of adult foundational education, is what does researcher-practitioner collaboration look like at each stage of this research process? And so we'll start with defining the issue. And I'm going to talk about this by way of a little bit of a case study of research that I've conducted, which began with the state of Oregon, where, and this is many years ago, they, at the time when we were, the field was really concentrating on the transition from basic skills to further education and training. Those of you who have been around in the early 2000s, that was kind of the new movement of the day, if you will. And I worked with Oregon for many years as their advisor and stuff. And they looked at the process of helping their ABE programs develop an advanced curricula so that students could bypass, the goal was to bypass developmental education as they were studying for the GED to move to further training. And so we did all those processes, and the innovative piece was to institute a semester-long college and career awareness course. It was one of the first ones that was done for AFE learners, because we really realized very early on that many adult AFE learners did not think about what they were going to do next, or did not see themselves as further education participants. So this was really the beginning of this whole strand of activity. One of the lessons learned from that, so the idea was, well, we'll get people better prepared to pass the GED and then to start to enroll. And when the state looked at the data and saw that many people were, in terms of they were using CASAs, the CASA scores were high, but students were either not signing up and taking the GED, as many as should, given the CASA scores at post-test, or they weren't completing the GED tests. So that was kind of a conundrum. Why not? They clearly have the skill set to do so. What was there? So there was another opportunity to have a researcher practitioner collaboration with Oregon in testing the use of customized text messaging. And this was in the early days of research on text messaging for high school students. And what we were seeing there was that it didn't necessarily work well when students got group texts. And because we know that adult learners very often come with different issues, if you will, or different needs, my hypothesis was we should customize the help that staff give to those needs, and you might get a better, help them retain better. So we started this collaborative process together. And one of the things that is really clear is to make sure that the question you're going to explore is the right question. Because sometimes issues arise, but you don't always hit the nail on the head with operationalizing what the question was. So what we did was to collect information about what Oregon was already doing at the state level, and they had started kind of an advisor program where the programs had a particular advisor to work with the students in that transition activities, which grew out of the previous thing. We also looked at the learner data to see who, again, verifying who on paper looked like they should be engaging in GED and enrolling in next steps, but was not doing that. And did that vary by programs, or was that, generally across the 17 programs that they have? And we also then talked to each of the programs because we wanted to see what was going on in those programs with this advisor activity already underway, and were they seeing any results? And so all that exploration to identify and define the issues, everyone agreed, both at the state level and Oregon has a working group of their program directors who meets as a council. And so the question that we had went to that council so that you had program directors' input. And through the interviews we did, we talked to the teachers as well. So there was universal, if you will, agreement that something is missing. We need something else, perhaps. What were some of the other barriers? So, and then we looked at the research, and the research said, just don't send people general text messages. You're not going to get the kinds of results. So that meant we had to customize them. So then the question is, what does customizing mean? Where were the points along the trajectory of an AFE student where they tend to disengage, in trying to figure out where would they need prompts? What were some of the challenges the learners faced? And clearly, for example, goal setting. When you work with adult learners, their goals change during their participation in AFE. And if that is not acknowledged explicitly, sometimes they don't stay in because they're not working toward the goals as the goals evolve. So we created essentially, this was going to be the product. So then thinking about what it looked like to design the project rather, there had to be an intervention, which is the text messaging. So we designed it to look like what these were the study questions. And we developed a logic model. And the logic model shows what assumptions were being made as we did this. So as you go through in working with collaboration, the researcher just doesn't sit there and do a logic model. The researcher needs to talk to all the key people involved in using this intervention to make sure that these assumptions make sense, right? Does that make sense? And so in this case, we had a target population. So in this 8th grade equivalent or higher, the high level of high intermediate on the NRS and that, because those were the folks who, if you looked at the GED pass rates in the state and you looked at the CASA scores, were most likely to be moving on. And we also then looked at the notion of providing advice and coaching. And they were already had these advisors, which one would have thought. So I will tell you the mistake I think the researcher made at the beginning was really thinking that the text messaging was powerful enough with the advising that the advisors were given to really move them along. And because the advisors had a lot of flexibility to do it. So we were in 7 different programs looking at this activity, you know. And so one of the things, it was a guess, right? And you make guesses. And so we went through and worked with their staff and said, okay, if you look where the students aren't moving along, we would expect that if they had more interactions, this is the mediators, right? And were able to figure out what was going on, they would then be more likely to take the GED, take all the tests, and enroll in college courses if that was their goal for the next time. So everybody had to buy into the theory of change. So this went to the group of the state directors, and we all did all that. So along the way, this is to tell you, it was constant conversation. It was not the research team sitting in a room doing all of this and presenting it to the state for approval. Rather, it was lots of conversations back and forth. Does this make sense? You know, will the local programs want to participate? Because we needed the programs to participate. What would their considerations be, right? And so we did all of those things in kind of firming the design for the study. And we were lucky to be able to do a random assignment study. And so it was there have been very few at that time random assignment studies done in adult ed. So we were in the beginning, and certainly nothing around using text messages. And so we had to get buy-in, if you will, from the teachers or the advisors in the programs to say, we will randomly assign your students. Some you will have to use text messaging with, and others you wouldn't within your whole group that you're advising. And so we went, and that took a fair, the setup of the study when you use collaborative means takes longer. So when a researcher is writing a proposal to do a study that is going to be a collaborative activity, you need to really put time in that front end to do all those, establish the relationships with different actors at different pieces, and actually do the work of double checking that your questions are the right questions, and that the outcomes are the right outcomes to measure, and that the instrumentation along the way will make sense. Okay. So the third step is the measures and the collection of the data. So we look, in this case, it was a fairly, I wouldn't say simple, but what our expectations was that we could see increases in GED taking, in GED success, attainment, and enrollments in college. And this would be what I would call the second piece. And because we were doing this study for IES is always very interested in those outcomes for adult learners when you do a study for them. In retrospect, and what we learned, which then we were able to do another study that followed, was that really what the text messaging is doing is helping people along the way to achieve the process steps that it takes to decide to sign up and take the GED test, and to keep at taking the GED test. And that if you're ready to think you might want to go to college, to then engage in figuring out, what do I want to study? And is this the right occupation? So the achievement of getting the GED by itself, or actually enrolling, was effected in a way that the text messaging really helped the retention and progress toward those, because many things go into getting a GED. your cognitive abilities are high on the list, not the fact that you got the text messaging per se, right? So what was really exciting about this research was because we were involved with the teachers and talking to the teachers a lot, and the state was by our side the whole time. And the program directors, I was having monthly reports outs with them. It was a very active environment. And because we kept seeing things change, and when things didn't work the way we had hypothesized, we could look at that. And I thought it was probably one of the studies I learned the most from, and I've done a lot of studies over many years, because there was such a lot of reaction as you were doing it. And you could see, oh, okay, if the teachers don't understand the pain points for students, for example, then it's harder to intervene, because what you want to do is avoid pain points. If you can anticipate where students are going to disengage, where they're going to have a hard time, and you can use the text messaging to remind them to keep on track, or to, if they have a small issue, to use that to resolve the issue, they're more likely to stay engaged. And engagement is, if they're not engaged, it's very hard to get to those outcomes. So anyway, our outcomes were those outcomes. And then we also looked at getting implementation information from the folks who were using the text messaging. The beauty in this one was we had the text messages as the data. So they were extremely rich data to look at what the advisor was saying, whether the advisor initiated the text or the students initiated the text. Did the students respond to the text? And very early on, a key lesson was when the advisors sent their students a text, the students did not always respond. Like, a lot of them didn't respond immediately. However, in talking to the students, we learned it wasn't because they didn't pay attention. It was that their protocol was, I don't need to say, okay, yes, I did it, or whatever. They just took the information and they acted on it. And meanwhile, the advisors are feeling badly. Maybe I'm not, they're not really, this is not helpful to them or whatever. So I said, well, what you need to do is maybe double check. Was this sufficient? Do you need any more help? So the tweaking along the way was interesting. And part of the evolution of the intervention, if you will, was looking at those points around the goal setting. Were they resetting their goals? Were they running into problems preparing to take the GED test? Were there other issues that they were encountering? Were they gathering information about what their possible next steps would be, so that they would be able to have that next step as an outcome at the end? And so we were trying to look at as much data as we could, as we went through that process. So as we went to analyze and interpret the data, again, we wanted to know, I kept saying to the state in particular and to the program directors, what do you want to know? So we analyzed data as we got it on an ongoing basis, so that I could report back to our program director group what were we seeing, because they want, I said, we have to analyze the data to meet our research questions, but there may be other questions that you might have as the project was going forward, and as the program directors were talking to their advisors in the program and saying, how is it going? Do the students like the text messaging or not, whatever. And so we responded to that. So we got their ongoing input as to what they would want to see by the end of the project. And if there were intermediate things I could report out, we did do that. This was really an interesting piece at this point, because there were a couple of questions people had. They wanted to know, again, if the students weren't responding, does that mean they didn't pay attention or it wasn't helpful? And so I asked the advisors to go back and actually ask the students, what, is this what you need and don't need? Or can we do more? We also wanted to know if, when we looked at the data, we weren't going to be able to definitively say whether we could say, as we analyze the data, we did not see differences in the two outcomes. So the control group, the ones who did not get the text messaging, and the treatment group who got the text messaging did not score differently in terms of GED attainment or enrollment. I wasn't surprised at that. I was more interested in saying, let's see whether or not the text messaging, how did that work? Because there were other factors that accounted for the no differences, and the text messaging wasn't going to be the critical one. That became apparent. But what was less apparent was what were the positive outputs from those text messages. Was there a better way to do the text messaging? And we saw differences in the way the text messages. Working with the state, there was a template for the kinds of text messages. So there were sample text messages, and there were the topics that we had hypothesized that they should be text messaging about. But there was a lot of flexibility in how they wrote them, because they didn't want to be told you must write it this way or that way. But here's the topics, and you kind of did. So when we then start to analyze the data, we can see that the messaging that was more than just supportive, that, keep at it, you're doing well, fine, that was less effective than the messages that said, do you have the materials you need to retake your test? Can I help you? Don't forget your test did you schedule it yet? In one of the programs, and this was a great example, in order to get the GED results, it was a different staff person had access to those results. And the program had to enable that person to get the GED results in a timely manner to the advisor. And so because if the advisor couldn't see what the results were right after taking the test, the advisor couldn't then reach out and say, yes, you did great, congratulations. So we ran into those, what you would call internal operational mechanisms, which you have to pay attention to as you're going there. So I guess that when we look back at the logic model, I was able to say, when I presented to the group of program directors and the state staff and the teachers, I said, okay, this is kind of what worked, and here's a couple of the areas where we think one would need to revise that. And so the dissemination, usually when I said to our project officer, I said, here we have one more adult education study where no differences. And he says, Judy, it's really important that you write about no differences and why. And at the same time, I was lucky enough to get another study. It was just a correlational descriptive study using text messaging that then ended up with 4 states in 10 programs right at the time the pandemic began. We had almost 500 students in this particular study. And it was extremely rich because I could work off the findings that we had just learned from the Oregon study and said, okay, I think that what you need to focus on is using those text messages around the engagement, the likely struggles that students are going to run into, and, the process of signing up. So that next study then was able to look at that. And in that study, we found a lot better, some relationships between success in those intermediate steps, which is what the only thing we could get data on during the pandemic, and the type of text messaging. So this hasn't been published yet. We just were able to finish that result recently. So there are these different stages, right? And there's different ways in which to collaborate with the main stakeholders of your study. And that's kind of the point that I want to make there. What you need to do, though, is I think it's important to start from where things don't go well is when the question is the wrong question at the beginning of the study. If you're looking at a problem and you haven't been able to sift through to look at root causes of that problem for the program, you might ask the question that is not quite on target. And I think that's the place to spend the extra time. And the other thing we did in spending extra time was in recruiting, in this case, the advisors. We met with the program director and each advisor for the programs who were interested, because they had to volunteer, but then we sat down and they had to understand how much more work it might be to not only do their advising role, but to track their students so they could send appropriate text messages. And a couple of the programs said we don't have the bandwidth to do that. This person's student. So it was good. The ones who committed stayed with it. And you don't ever want to lose your sample size, right? So that's an important consideration. And they were then very good. At one of the meetings, we had the advisors get up and talk about the process, because they're the ones that use the new intervention. They're the ones that were producing the data through the text messaging. And so it was really important to hear the people using it. And there were some, in the second study, we were able to ask the learners to write back. We texted them and said, tell us about your experience. And so we did get some learner data back on that. And so I'm going to stop so that we can go to the next. Yes, questions. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes. This was before the pandemic, so these were, yeah, no, they were face to face. Yeah. Yes, yeah, well, we checked on that. Yes, because I didn't want to confound it, right? Right. So the teachers were not doing the text messaging at any, it was the advisors. One advisor had been doing text messaging already. And so this was one where we didn't want them to text message the control group. So we had to make sure that wasn't going to take place. The more interesting on this one, the pandemic, the other study, it was first year. Everybody was online, right? And they were also using the text. We did the Signal Vine. We brought in the platform because they did not have to use their own phones. We did not want them to use their phones. We wanted them to use Signal Vine. It was very, controlled, and we got all the transcripts, obviously. And what we wanted to do is to try to get them not to use their phone for text messaging. So and this is the second study because some of them were already used to using their phone during the pandemic. So it was a little bit harder to control that piece of it. Yes, no, we could not, no, the only thing unfortunately was this is what IES used to call a low cost study. It was indeed low cost. It was, so we couldn't do the teachers, but I interviewed and met with the advisors. So I knew, and what the advisors said, this was an interesting, they said, you know, the students really want to come in and sit and talk to us. So I can only use the text messaging to kind of like set those appointments up. And it was like around the periphery. In contrast, when everybody was online, the meat of those conversations was more robust because that was how they were communicating. Yeah. Yes.
Your point that you said it was, that your disappointment that there was no difference when we first told you that that's important, right? About
Yeah.
I'm really excited about this study. Actually.
Yeah.
And I feel how important nuance is.
Yeah.
And give me a problem, then tell me the solution.
Right.
What is the problem? You need to give a solution.
Yeah. Well, and what I learned through why I was excited was because when I got to do the second study, I said, oh, of course. The text message is only going to get you so far. And if you want to do more text messaging work, you have to place it appropriately as an intervention and understand how to use that. It is not going to be the end all be all for passing that GED test. Now, if they schedule the test and don't take it, yes, but so I think learning about these interventions and their correct use, right? And then the support is something the field has not critically evaluated enough, which is, I think, your point. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Spoke about there not being a difference for testing or pieces there. But was there a difference whenever it came to attendance to classes or showing up for a test that maybe like between the control group and the
And I don't remember, to tell you the truth. We did take look at attendance. We have those data. What I saw through the text messaging was this has not been written up yet because anyway, there's some really rich data that by accumulating the text messages, you can see the quality of those conversations. And that to me is important. I don't know, I don't believe there was as much text messaging done in the control group. We couldn't measure that. We could only measure it for the treatment group. So I don't know to answer your question. Because it said, yes, I'll come back to, when the students keep saying, thank you, I wouldn't have done this, or thank you, I'm coming back, that tells me that there was some input, on that, some result. Yes.
you started there, you said that also
No, I looked at the high school studies. Yeah, I didn't see any other adult ed studies. When we did this in 19, whatever, this was the first one I saw for adult ed. Yes.
Did you have the same kind of
Mhm. Yeah. Yes, and we used it. We had a community of practice actually. And we were on the phone every 2 months. Because we really had to engage them. I mean, we couldn't travel. I mean, so everything was done Zoom, or regular phone in some cases. And I mean, I've always done my research. You start with the state, you then go to the local programs, you talk to everybody, has some input. Just because if you want anything to work, it needs to be, especially because it does no good to devise a new practice or curriculum if nobody wants to use it. So you don't want to spend money doing that. People have got to say, yes, this looks good, and I'm willing to try to use it. And then you get their feedback the whole time, constant feedback on its use. And then at least you've done it so that it seems to be a valid implementation, if nothing else, Yes.
I'm flabbergasted by the amount of duration we have.
Mhm.
Said that, of course. How much time did it take from start to finish? And can you compare that to what would happen without that robust interaction?
Yes, this ended up being about a 5-year study, the first one, the Oregon study, and it took a good year to get everything going. What happens if you don't get input is they don't do it. I mean, and if they didn't want to use like Signal Vine and didn't want, I mean, they gave us feedback on the Signal Vine at that time, you couldn't use it on your app or something, whatever it was, the app was not well developed enough, and that got a little bit irritating because they had to wait till they got back to their desk to do it. So we knew I mean, I have to say, people are not reticent to tell you what they like and don't like. And I loved it because that to me, there was a certain amount of trust there. I said, I'm learning from what they're doing. So we're all partners in the learning process. So please give me as much feedback. It doesn't hurt me at all if you say this didn't work very well, it's fine. Yeah.
Were there any groups of
We asked the students had to agree to do it. Oh, each student, I didn't, because they all have to sign because they're participating in studies. Some students decided they didn't want to be bothered, so they never signed up. So the teachers had to recruit the students, and then the students had to understand, they had to respond to the text messages, they would receive this. But very few, some of the ones said, I just want to get this done. I don't want to be bothered being in this study, which is fine. Yeah.
The contents of those messages at some point, you mentioned that those students were receiving positive messages that did not perform as well as those who were simply reminded of things like bring the materials and find something.
One of the last things we just were able to do is to run that correlation, because we ran out of money for that second study. And I'm gonna write it up, because I think it's really, I think will be interesting. Yeah, I want to stop because we want to engage with you, and I'm going to give it to Lisa.
Thanks, Judy. Hoping that if folks online have questions, that they'll pop them into a chat and that Adam can actually see them. That would be great. We wanted to have a little time for you to share some ideas among yourselves, and also give us continuous food for thinking to bring back to the network, to our research teams and all. Actually, can you go back? First question, how many of you, who in the room has been involved in a research practice collaboration, either from a researcher side or a program side? Go ahead, raise your hands. Oh, good. A whole bunch of you. Would someone like to share some of the topics that you explored? I think, did you?
I was a teacher and administrator.
We worked with Georgia State on our program, worked with Georgia State to recruit students for their literacy studies and things like that. So
Okay.
that's one thing.
Great. Okay. Some others? What are the other kinds of things that folks have been part of learning about through these research collaborations? Yeah, I'm going to make sure. I'm worried that the folks online might not hear us, so just want to
I did a study on teacher teaching styles and students' learning styles in a technical setting. And then the teachers changed their behavior based on the results of the learning style inventory of the students. And then the students were able to submit evidence of their learning according to their learning.
That's great. Different ones. Did you have one, sir? No, you're good. Okay. Well, hang on, kind of.
Hi. Yes, I'm with Academy, I'm Sasha Lotus with Academy of Hope Adult Public Charter School in Washington, DC. And we are working with American Institute for Research. We're actually presenting our study on Wednesday at 8, a plug for, and it's really looking at all of what the factors that get in the way of persistence or that help with completing GED programs and adult basic education programs.
I want to go to that session because years ago, as a grad student, I was part of a kind of groundbreaking study, a seminal study looking at persistence among GED learners. That was, gosh, I think we published. No, it was John Cummings, Andrea Perella from the National Center for the Study of Adult Learning and Literacy in what feels like 1,000 years ago, but I think it was more like 20. So I'm going to get up and come to your session. See, that's why we do this, so that we find out new things. So if you were to participate, when Judy talked about those research phases, right, that defining the question, designing the study, setting up that data collection, doing that analysis, and then that important piece of reporting and telling the world about what you found, which of those phases seem interesting to folks, and why? What in that process kind of appeals to you? Either as a researcher who says, oh, this would be an awesome, I would love to collaborate more at this stage of my study, or as someone working in a program who says, yeah, I'd really like to make sure they do that piece right. Which of those appeal? I'll start here and then come back.
For me, it's the really the research designed, in terms of relating it to a dissertation, the chapter 3, figuring out how you're going to set it up to analyze the data.
Yep, because really things can be made or broken at that point.
Yep, I agree. I think it's design is everything. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't know if there's really one aspect of a research project as a process that would be more important or more profoundly, considered in the planning process. I think they all matter because ultimately we would like to get the outcome, right? And that's what we're looking at. And I don't want to sit, 2-3 years later, depending on the length, right? Oh gosh, I should have done it differently. So I think that planning is very important. And again, I don't know if there's any one particular part that I would like to do better than others.
I think because I enjoyed the qualitative research side of things. So when I was working on my degree, so the storytelling. So I think that end part where I'm able to actually kind of tell the story is where I would be more engaged.
Great. All right, looking at time, I want to stop and give you all a chance to talk with each other. So move around, figure groups of, I'll say 2, 3, or 4, whatever seems to work in terms of space. And we want you to talk about some of these questions. What do you think is important for researchers to understand about your program context? And I invite you, if you've been a researcher, what do you think are the important kinds of questions you should be asking to understand context? So that's one question, context. The other is, what advice would you give to researchers? Or researchers, what would you do differently and better next time you go about this kind of process? And then what questions, or I would even say kind of persistent things you're still thinking about related to research collaboration? What kinds of questions do you have? So context, advice, and questions. Go ahead and talk. We'll take give you about 7 minutes or so, and then we'll come back with another question to close out.
That's just my hunch.
We don't here. I know we don't. Yeah. Let's just change the slide.
Can we change
I don't want to touch,
Okay.
I don't
Just
want to
keep going.
touch.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah, I don't.
Oh, go back.
Yeah.
I heard the same topic about like. Are you working on it? Are you working
I'm glad I was here. Very messy.
I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Where are you? Very cool. Oh, here it is. No, that's fascinating.
What's a real question? If they don't have, so it's like, it's really more value. Just wanting to follow us out. And then you're just sort of, like you're saying, like that. That is no. That's right. Yeah. All right, I wonder if we could, oh, again, I should probably use the mic.
Okay, yes, it's working again. I wonder if we could just grab a couple of good nuggets from your conversations, and then we have a question to wrap up where we would love to get your insights to help guide the research teams as they're approaching their ends. Anybody want to share a great nugget? Something that came up in your conversation could be related to any of those three questions. There was, I have to say, the level of engagement was really impressive and gratifying for our team to see that you were all talking. So you must have been saying some good things, right? Who'd like to share something? Try, come on. I can call on people, but nobody likes that one. Yes, there we go.
Okay.
We just had a nice conversation about how state or Puerto Rico structuring is so different. And so when you're coming to the research to really thinking about, okay, does every school have this? Is it in K-12? Is it in the JC? Is it a smorgasbord? And thinking about how within the research, you're considering these different contexts, which is very related to the talk that we heard, but even just knowing the lay of the land of the larger state in which your context is sitting.
I think that's a great point because those contexts make a lot of differences in terms of freedom, constraints, resources, preparation of teachers, all kinds of things. Yep. Anybody else want to share something interesting that came up in your conversations? Well, y'all looked happy, so I'm glad that it was at least a good exchange. All right, last slide. Okay, here's where we could really use your help. The teams are in the process now of their pilot stages. They're starting to get their findings. They're all going to have to communicate with the world. How can we ensure that those teams do a good job? What's important in formulating and communicating those findings so that they're not just for researchers to all share among researchers and do their fancy slides with the tables that mean nothing to practitioners with the p-values, et cetera, but how do we make sure that those teams are communicating in ways that really are meaningful for both practitioners and the learners? I feel like this is a frontier for us. This is a place we got to push as a field. How do we tell the learners what we've learned about them?
Well, thank you for talking about not putting a bunch of slides with p-values and everything, because no, not gonna work. I think this gentleman over here really shared that idea of when you share the results, put it in a I think it's just a narrative form, telling the story, so it really impacts. And I always jump down to the conclusions on a report because it has all the math in there, and I jump down to the meat of it to say, well, what does this mean? What are the implications? What are how does this impact my daily lives of our learners, right? So the narratives, who is it, how does it impact, and just really telling the stories, I think, is a big issue.
That's great. Got that, create folks, for the research teams? What are some other, yes.
You probably already do this, but do you have any, in your conclusions, do you have and these are our suggestions, here's some ideas we came up with based on these results, maybe you could try doing this. I mean, is that kind of what you're already doing? Because that would be useful for me. I haven't looked at any of this research though, so this is totally new for me.
Great. Well, we want you to check out the website, see what's there, and keep watching as the findings come out. But that really, it's the so what. Okay, y'all did this, but really, what am I supposed to take away? How does this help me understand learners better, or things that I should do in my classroom? So I think that practical application is something we can definitely ensure is there. Yeah.
And this isn't an answer, it's more my thinking, because I've been having this question as well, especially as our research is becoming more and more to the public. And what is that divide? I mean, does it have to be so absolute between very, very researchy and p-values, and the other end is distilling it down to, there's got to be something in the middle there, and I'm not sure what that is. The only thing I can think of is there is power in research in terms of, if research is really just saying, I'm a practitioner, I've seen this all the time, right? I know this, you could ask me, but it's an opinion. And if someone can say, we did it, this is peer review, this was good, here it is, then that is your power. And I think that's, for me, that's why as a practitioner, that is why I became a researcher, is so that it's not just my idea. It's saying, hey, bump, it's saying bump, then people will fund it and policy will come.
There we go. Okay. So the rigor is okay. The rigor is a good thing to have, and we should elevate it and tell the story. Yes.
Sure. As I look at this question, I think that first of all, thank you for including the learners. It seems like every time we do our research, it's for us, people in the know. So yeah, I appreciate the angle. I agree with the idea of a story. Let's just make sure that it's meaningful. Look at the theory of undergraduate, we are all adults. We are pragmatic. We are purposeful. So are our students. So we would like to make sure that whatever it is that we are communicating to them makes sense to them. So probably the best thing to do would be, okay, how do you guys feel about this? Ask the students, right? The recipients of this. From our perspective, when it comes to, again, design of the research, well, make it focused on what it is that students will take advantage of. Again, the story is cool, but it's not a stand-up comedy, right? It's not supposed to be just entertaining. It needs to be informative. It needs to be meaningful. I think you said relevant. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. If any of you have seen examples of this reporting of research findings done well, please let us know. Please share their, you can reach out to the network through the website. But that would be really helpful because we all want the teams to do a good job because that's this research was there for the field. So yes, please.
I think if you're interested in communicating it to the learners, can you consider a visual mechanism for communicating to them and also turn it into a GED lesson or a language lesson on reading graphics because we all have to produce those for our students?
That's a great, I love that idea. Love that. We could do like a teaching skills that matter, research related. Yeah, there's something there. That's awesome. Love that. Love that. How are we doing on time? I think we are probably just about the end. Want to thank you all for coming, for joining us, for engaging in the conversation and hearing the presentation. And please reach out with questions and hope that you'll check out the Create website and follow the research as all those findings come to the fore. Thank you. And thanks to the folks online for hanging in with us.